Hello everyone. I hope you are all doing well today. Once again, it's Casey here from the Mather, Evanston, to give another art history talk today. And before we jump right into the artist we're exploring today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge where we're at today, to give us an opportunity to check back in with ourselves. I think especially in the midst of change or in a busy everyday life, we sometimes don't give ourselves the moment to check back in with ourselves and say, how am I really doing? So whatever feelings you're having today, whether it's uncertainty, anxiety, maybe you're feeling joy and hope. We can be on this wide spectrum of emotion, and I think it's important to acknowledge them and honor them wherever you're at right now. And really take a moment to check in with yourself. And maybe you don't know how you're feeling, and that's okay too. But just giving ourselves that moment to kind of check in. And whatever emotions or thoughts you're bringing to our time together today as we sit together, it's important to acknowledge them and give our minds a break from all the chatter and all those emotions and thoughts. That is a wonderful thing about engaging in the arts and why I love them. Whether it's music, visual arts, cooking, gardening, dancing, all of those creative activities, they give us the time and space to really focus on the present moment. And it gives us something positive to focus on at the time. So no matter where you are on that spectrum of emotion, my hope is for the next 40 minutes or so as we're together, that you are able to kind of take a moment and be in the present with me as we go through this wonderful artist today. And before we get started with her, I thought we could do a little bit of deep breathing together. We always start with a little meditation just to help us, again, stay in the present moment a little bit better because we're connecting with our breath. So why don't you find kind of a comfortable seat in your chair. Settle in. Your feet are firmly on the ground and your hands can be resting in your lap. They could be kind of clasped together on your lap or on the arms of your chair. Just make sure that they're resting comfortably. And we're just gonna really try to stay in the present moment when we do our breaths today. So try to let go of all those thoughts running through your head or any of the emotions you're feeling and just focus back on the breath while we kind of breathe together. You can close your eyes or you can kind of shift your eyes slightly downward as we breathe together. We'll do a few of those. So we'll start with a good inhale and then exhale. Focusing on that feeling of the air filling up your lungs and then letting it go. Letting it go. And our last one for the day. Okay. Awesome. Well, now that we're a little bit more present, maybe we can jump right in to today's artist. And I'm excited to talk about her today. And you're getting a little preview about her at the painting right next to me, or on the easel here, this photograph. And it's your little sneak peek. But I'm excited about her because we've talked a lot about painters. The Roger Brown, the artist that we talked about last week, and many other artists, we usually highlight painters, and I wanted to do something different today. So I am highlighting a sculptor. And she was influential to the art world with her style and ingenuity, but also to the feminist movement. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those as we get going. But you may recognize her. It is Louise Nevelson. This is her right here. So some of you may know her, perhaps you know a little bit about her work, but it had been very impactful for me to learn about her from a personal standpoint, partly because her artwork brought back a very vivid memory for me. I always loved arts in school. Art class was my favorite class always. And I remember being in elementary school and doing a sculpture project that was inspired by Louise Nevelson. And I think my parents still have it somewhere in their house. And we collected objects from around our house and assembled them together into a sculpture, which is exactly how she worked. And we'll kind of learn more about that as we get into what her process was. But let's talk a little bit first about her background and what influenced her to want to be a sculptor. Nevelson was born in the Russian Empire, actually, in what is now Ukraine. She was born in 1899. And in 1905, her family immigrated to the United States and they settled in Maine. So she was only 6 at the time when she left Russia and moved to the United States. Her father, initially, they struggled as immigrants to find a steady job. But eventually he became successful in a lumber yard. He ended up owning his own lumber yard and became a realtor around the area. And she was very close to her father, and his influence, as we see, kind of continued throughout her entire art career because she ended up actually focusing on wood. And many people believe that was because she grew up around the lumber yards. She grew up seeing all of the wood and being around all that sawdust and that raw material up in Maine. So she was interested in art at a very young age. And that's kind of common of all of the artists that we talk about. Most of them had some sort of interest in art at a young age. And she's unique though, and she has a very specific instance that she said inspired her artistic career. It was when she saw a plaster cast of a statue of Joan of Arc at the Rockland Public Library when she was very young. That inspired her to want to take art lessons throughout school. I wonder if any of you resonate with that, if any of you have had a very specific memory from your childhood that put you on a path. Maybe a specific instance or conversation or something you saw that made you say, I want to do that. Well, that is exactly what happened to Nevelson with that statue that really put her on the path of being an artist and really wanting to explore her artwork. So she refined her skills throughout school, initially focusing on watercolor painting actually and drawing figures, so really learning basic skills. She didn't really venture into sculpture when she was young, however. Even though she really loved art, it was more what the school could teach her at the time. So she really wanted to leave her hometown when she graduated high school. She wanted to go out and see the world. She wanted to get into a bigger art scene than rural Maine. But instead, life had other plans, and she took a job as a stenographer. I think that's how you say it. At a local law office. There she met Charles Nevelson, and they were married in 1920, and she was just 21 years old when they were married. And that was to the great pleasure of her parents. They wanted her to marry someone who was successful and could provide for her. And then she was finally able to do that, and with him, though, she did end up leaving Maine and moving to New York City. She went for his job in law, but she kind of fulfilled her own dream as well about leaving Maine and getting to the big city. And it was shortly after their move in 1922 that she had her son. Now, it's about this time that Louise Nevelson's story gets a little more complicated. Her in-laws, who she lived close to in New York, they disapproved of her wanting to study the arts. They really wanted her to stay at home and be a homemaker for her family and support their son. But Nevelson was feeling that artistic drive inside herself that she had felt from a young child. While she cared about her husband and son as well, she wanted to be able to pursue arts. So she didn't give up on her dream, and she fiercely was determined to continue learning art. So in 1928, when she was 29, she enrolled in classes at the Art Students League in New York City, despite the disapproval of her family at the time. She said this of her in-laws, and I think this is a really wonderful quote. She said, "My husband's family was terribly refined. Within that circle, you could know Beethoven, but God forbid you were Beethoven." And I think that that's just incredible perspective, that they enjoyed the arts, but they did not want her to be an artist. She must have been very strong-willed as a person to be able to still pursue her dreams no matter the pressure she was getting from her family. So she remained in school for 2 years, but her family, because of her husband's job, they had to leave New York City for Mount Vernon, New York. So she was removed once again from environment. She was removed from the environment where she felt she was thriving in New York City, and she had to move to rural New York. So she had to leave her art career behind. Now this is when she was faced with a very difficult choice, and it further gets complicated in her early life story. She was devastated, as I said, about leaving New York City and the art scene and the life of a country, and the demands of family life are hard for her. So in 1931, she actually separated from her husband, and she left her son in the care of her husband to travel to Germany to continue to refine her artistic craft. And I have to imagine, I don't know if that was a difficult decision for her, but it definitely had to be hard to choose between those two things, your passion and your family. And I'm not sure if any of you have had to make a difficult choice like that, but it's those types of choices, I think, that determine the path of the rest of your life. And Louise Nevelson was determined to make that choice and determined to take the path of an artist. And that is exactly what she did. She went to Germany. She learned under the artist Han Hofmann at his School for Modern Art. And she chose to do this independently from her family and her emotional support system. And she eventually divorced her husband, but what's interesting is she never asked financial assistance from him. She was determined to be fiercely independent. And you can kind of see that determination in this picture. This picture was taken after, obviously, she went through all of these difficult choices, because this is later in her life. But if you look at her, she looks like very determined, very steadfast and strong-willed, just in her face. So I liked this photograph because I thought it captured her energy that I imagine that she portrayed as an artist. So here's one of her first works, and we'll talk about how this came to pass. So she didn't stay in Germany for long. She moved back to New York in 1932. She actually moved to escape the political tension that was building up in Germany because of the World War. And she wanted to be back in the country that she felt inspired by from her youth. She missed the United States. She says this, she said, "I could be a leaf on a tree in Paris, but I could be the whole tree in America." And I think that that's a really also amazing quote from her, in the fact that she felt America could give her the opportunities she desired, to give her that individuality, the opportunity to be not just a small part of a whole, but the entire tree. When she returned, she enrolled in the Artist League. She studied painting, sculpture, and dance. So in the 1940s, we're fast forwarding to the 1940s now, she continued to refine her sculpture, and it was starting to get some notice, some small notice from the art world. She was being included in some shows, she was selling some artwork, but she wasn't getting a lot of momentum. She was still struggling financially. But this is an example of one of her smaller, what she calls assemblages. So it's a combination. She would make a lot of sculptures that were combinations of found objects, different material, into one cohesive whole. This piece here is titled Moving Static, Moving Figure. It was done in 1947. So this piece was created out of wood, terracotta clay, and bronze, which were all painted black. The bronze is this beam that runs through pieces of wood and terracotta, and what's interesting is we can't distinguish which is wood and which is terracotta, which is kind of what she goes for in her artwork. She wants it to not be separate pieces, but seem like a cohesive whole. But as I said, she was still struggling to support herself as an artist. Partly this may be due to the fact that she was a woman sculptor, and she was often written off at this time for juried shows or galleries. She came to think of herself as sort of an outcast among artists of the time, unable to fit into the club, as she said. But that didn't stop her, and I think it was this innate desire within her to be an artist and make art that the criticism or the feeling like an outcast didn't stop her. She continued to push on and refine her skills. And she drew from Cubism and Surrealism as part of her work, and we'll notice the Cubism in here, where every small piece looks like it's pieces put into a cohesive whole once again. All right, so now we are moving on to look at her work as we get into the 50s. So we have another sculpture here. So the fact that she was dedicated into continuing to explore her craft led to the success that she started to get in the 1950s. She started to create these dream-like constructions made out of small boxes and pieces of wood, and they were always painted in one color. So as we can see here, these are small bits and pieces of wood nailed together to create this one form. And she left this piece untitled. So she didn't title this piece, but I wonder what it reminds you of. If you see anything in there, like the style or the shapes. It reminds me maybe of a building or a figure, a person, maybe. But it is very visually interesting, and as we can see, this is starting to be on a larger scale than the piece that we had just seen, which was maybe only this big. This piece was almost human-sized. It's very large. Now, interestingly, this is the only completely green sculpture that Nevelson ever created. But it was the first to gain recognition for its size and interest. So all of her work in the 1950s was actually meant to invoke the feelings of urban landscapes and tall buildings. She wanted it to feel like New York City. And she chose to paint her sculptures all one color because she really wanted to show the form and the shadows. So because all of it is green, we can really see in here the dark shadows and the contrast that all of the same color allows us to see those details. And this is really when wood came to be her signature material. And she works with this through the following decades. Now, this is different than her male counterparts, her male sculptors that were around her at this time, making things at the same time. They used primarily marble, clay, or metal. But as I mentioned before, many critics believe she used wood because it reminded her of her childhood. It was her father in the lumberyard. And there was also something living about wood that really interested Nevelson. And that it can be easily constructed into these assemblages as well, and is relatively light, able to be nailed together and hold its form. So we see over time that her sculptures continue to get greater, and this is, I think, the first example of one of her outstanding works, one of the ones that gave her the most recognition. Now, it might be kind of hard for you to see this, but these are all smaller boxes filled with various wood forms. We can see what looks like reeds down here, pieces of furniture, parts, keys, rods, different shapes of wood, all assembled together within these boxed forms. That's the height of an entire wall. Now, this work was called Sky Cathedral. It was done in 1958. Now, what's interesting about the evolution of her work is that she was beginning to gather wood pieces that were distinguishing pieces of furniture or tools. Before, as we saw in the blue sculpture, they were just small pieces of wood or larger planes of wood, not recognizable objects. But now she was taking recognizable objects, wooden wheels, spools, sticks, tools, and she was beginning to incorporate all of those in these boxes and in these sculptures, in these nailed and glued in these little wood cubbies. And it was really also supposed to represent the New York landscape. She would walk around the streets of New York and she would pick up wood scraps or discarded furniture. She was using the physical objects of the environment around her to create these works. So I wonder what you think of this. If you feel like it would be impressive to stand in front of something like this. You know, I feel like I like it because it reminds me, it's intriguing. It draws my eye in because I want to try to figure out what all of the wood pieces are, or there feels like there's a lot to look at, and I could look at this piece for a long time trying to kind of decipher it, while at the same time taking in the whole piece as one art form. So it is both tiny separate pieces and all one at the same time, which I think is fascinating. So the choice to paint her sculptures all one color, and this one black in particular, is purposeful, because she talks about, when you read her writing, that she wants to eliminate the history of an object as it's incorporated into her sculpture. And eliminating the history, how she goes about doing that is either she takes it apart, uses pieces, but she also paints them all the same color, so it unifies them in a way to all be part of the one sculpture. And she was, as a student, she was taught to only use black and white to discipline herself, which actually resulted in her using mostly black and white throughout all of her sculpture works for her entire career. She chose black because she said it represented a silhouette or essence of the universe. She liked that black is the only color that encompasses all colors. It's the totality, it is everything. So it is both everything and seemingly nothing at the same time. And she liked that dichotomy, she liked that comparison. That's why she chose black most often. So she really also wanted the black sculptures to inspire awe in the viewer and really inspire them. So I don't know if you would feel that way to see something black, all black, or all another color. Now, I think we should remember what this looks like as we look at our next work, because in my opinion, it's this coming up work that feels more awe-inspiring to me. Now this work is when she really started to pick up and really started to get recognition. This is in the 60s. And as we can see here, she did not paint it white or black. It is painted a beautiful gold. So that's partly because of the occasion she made this work for. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So this piece is titled Royal Tide 1. It was a series of large-scale works. This is the first one in the series, created in 1960. And it was made to be exhibited in the Venice Biennial in 1962 in Italy. So in the 60s, she was really starting to be asked by shows or to get commissions all over the world. Her artwork was getting that recognition that she was really struggling for at the beginning. So she's being asked to, she created this piece being asked to add to Italy's bicentennial. So again, as I said, she branched away from her standard black and white here into this beautiful gold, but the construction of this work is the same as the one we've seen previously. We can see these small boxes filled with found objects. And I think in this image it's a little bit easier to point some things out because we can see more contrast and individual lines when it's painted gold. So you see the leg of a chair here, some wheels, there looks like there's a wooden instrument, another leg of a chair, scraps of wood, buttresses from buildings, scaffolding from buildings, candlesticks it looks like. So all of these things being combined again into one and painted all the same color. Now I wonder if the gold gives you a different feeling than the all black sculpture did. For me, I feel more hopeful or more uplifted looking at the gold sculpture than the black. But it also has sort of a regal quality, and I think that that's what she was going for with Royal Tide. She titled this work and others in the Royal Tide series as her Baroque period. Now, if anyone knows art history or the style of the Baroque period, it's very ornate and often has a lot of gold leaf. It has lots of curving lines. It's very regal and ornate. And that's what she was going for in the gold pieces. She calls it her Baroque period. So now she was starting to explore themes of royalty, and that is the one is particularly highlighted in this piece. And I think it's interesting why royalty. And she talks a lot about that America is the golden land of opportunity. So she was kind of highlighting on that. But she also, which I find fascinating, considered herself a bit of royalty. She figured she should have been royal, which I think is fascinating. And so this is kind of her homage, her altar to her royal self. So she sounds like a fascinating person. I would have loved to know her. So we are moving along. This next piece we have, this is titled Transparent Sculpture 5. And you'll notice that Nevelson very rarely names her sculptures. They're mostly just descriptive and numbered. I didn't find any information on if that was intentional or not. But regardless, this is Transparent Sculpture 5. So in the late 60s, which I think is interesting because Nevelson was born in 1899, every decade, so if she's in the 60s working, creating in 1960, she was also in her 60s as an artist in her age. So it's interesting the time kind of correlates with her age. So she's in her 60s and her art took another evolution. So we saw her go from small works to these large, ornate sculptures of found objects. And now we're moving into the next evolution of her work. She began to experiment with material and style. She abandoned her classic wood materials for more man-made materials in this period. She used a lot of plastic, steel, fiberglass, and latex. The piece we see here is formed out of transparent plastic boxes. Now it's hard to make out what is happening here, but it's actually a bunch of small boxes connected to one another and constructed into what she called tabletop forms. So they were only about this big, of these small box constructions. So they're much smaller than her wood pieces. But what's interesting is she said that switching materials was a blessing because she liked the idea that her sculptures could now withstand the elements. And she liked the freedom that came with changing her size and material. So I don't know if any of you are artists, or maybe even just in your life, if you're working with something for so long, or you're working in a specific way so long, it can be refreshing to change. And for some people that's scary, but for Nevelson and for some of you, I imagine, it can be refreshing to get a change of pace, to think in a new way, to be challenged, to think of something in a different way, to keep your work fresh. So that's what she was going for. And I think that's quite a bold move from her. I mean, she was just starting to gain international recognition for these large-scale wood forms, and she then decided to switch her medium completely. It's very bold, I think. So I think that though that highlights that she was always creating from her own artistic self. She was never trying to fit in. She was making art for art's sake and for her own expression. So I wonder if you like these smaller plexiglass plastic forms, or you like her bigger ornate wood forms. I don't know. I like them both in different ways. So now we'll go through another evolution. We have these. So in 1967, the Whitney Museum of American Art hosted its first museum retrospective of Nevelson and exhibited over 100 of her works spanning her entire career. So she really felt like she had made it, and critics really felt like she made it. She has starting to get these retrospectives, she's getting this recognition, creating hundreds of works. She had been creating for almost 4 decades, but she didn't stop there. 2 years after her retrospective show, and she was well into her 70s at this point, she received her first commission for a large-scale sculpture for Princeton University in 1971. So she once again changed her medium. We've gone from wood assemblages to these plexiglass, plastic kind of connected works, and now we're moving into large-scale public sculptures. And these sculptures, of course, if they're out in the public, and they're out in squares to the elements, she made them out of metal, which is a material she had never worked with before. And she just started working with it when she was in her 70s. So she started working with steel and salvaged steel parts. So I found this quote about this shift, and she said, "Remember, I was in my early 70s when I came into monumental outdoor sculpture. I had been through the enclosures of wood. I had been through the shadows. I had been through the enclosures and come out into the open." And I think of what a beautiful way to say that. She had felt like the wood had given her everything it could. She was ready to expand her artwork to even a bigger scale, to bring it outdoors and bring it in the face of the public. She was ready to take it out of the gallery and out of the museum and bring it out into the world. So the piece we see here is titled Shadows and Flags. It was created in 1978. And what's interesting is it was commissioned by New York City, the city that she had been so wanting to go to, the city she had created for decades. And what is just so full circle and so amazing is that the city commissioned this work, but they also named this square after her. They named it Louise Nevelson Plaza in honor of her legacy and her work for the city. So she wanted to create a piece that would revigorate this empty square, but also give the opportunity for her to show her individual style. So we see here, and it might be hard for you to distinguish that far away, but there's these long pillars that go down to the ground. And on the top are these sweeping forms that are kind of moving across. And they're made out of steel and salvaged steel parts and gears and from equipment. And they're welded together on top of these pillars, meant to look like flags waving in the breeze. So even though she switched mediums, the way she was working was very similar. She was still taking bits and pieces and putting them together to a larger whole, except now it was metal and in this large scale. And she was there throughout the entire construction. She worked with a few other people, but she would hire people to have cranes, and she would take the metal pieces on cranes and lift them up to be welded in place, and she was instructing the whole time. She was 79 and out there in that square telling people where to put the metal, and I'm sure that was an amazing sight. I would have loved to see them being constructed in real time in that plaza. So she continued to make 22 public art pieces towards the end of her life, all site-specific. So she continued to work, and she really, then her mission switched to wanting to bring the arts to the public at large. So we'll end on another photograph of her. I just think that this is an amazing photo. We see her in these beautiful wooden, like, wearable art. It looks like she took her artwork into a necklace, into a wearable form. This wonderful hat. So Nevelson continued to make work up into her death until 1988, and she was 88 at the time she died. But what is so important about her and many impactful artists is the legacy that they leave behind that continues to inspire others for years to come. Her work was very important in the history of feminist art and feminism in general. She was a single woman leaving her family in pursuit of an art career. That was unheard of at the time, especially considering the field of art was very male-dominated. So there weren't that many women who were even creating art on this scale, especially in sculpture, at the time she was doing it. So she worked not only to represent women in the art world, but to bring to light more options to what women consider femininity, what women consider feminine. She was blunt, strong, daring, and unapologetic in her identity as an artist. She had her own fierce style, as we can see here. And she made sure her work was noticed. She made sure it was appreciated. She gave other women artists the permission to create work and join the art world through her courage. And I think I'll end on this quote today. Nevelson said, "I never liked the middle ground, the most boring place in the world." So my challenge for you this week is maybe create something bold, maybe create something outside of your comfort zone. Maybe it's making a sculpture like Nevelson, finding things within your house, combining them together, painting them all one color and seeing those forms just like Nevelson would do. But whatever it is, whatever you create, I hope you are inspired. And I also hope you stay well until we can talk to each other again. And thank you for tuning in with me today.